Hello and welcome to Silent Cities, the Commonwealth War Graves YouTube series. I am Alistair.
I'm Alexander.
And in this episode, Alexander, you caught up with our in-house historian George Hay.
Absolutely. I think it was great to talk to George about his work with the Non-Commemoration Report. Welcome, George.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yes, it's a pleasure. So, as an official historian, what first got you interested in history?
Okay, these are sort of long and complex questions, aren't they? I think, like most people with an interest in history, I have a sort of attraction to the sort of lost world of the past, the romanticised version of the past. I spent most of my career, obviously, disproving that, but it's hard to escape. I think that's where the passion originally comes from. In particular, I think my interests have always revolved around rural history. I grew up in the countryside, sort of connected to that. And then military history and the intersection between the two, which was ultimately what I did at PhD. One thing I do remember from my youth is my grandfather had a book, a gazetteer of Second World War military sites and leftover bits of artefact in the countryside of Sussex, weirdly. And I think that captured my imagination. And there is, up above a village called Amberley in West Sussex, the hull of a Churchill Mark II tank, which as a teenager is pretty cool anyway. It's riddled with bullet holes.
Lots of places to go and discover and hide.
But I think then what maybe takes you from the general interest into something maybe deeper and connects you maybe with the history more is, why it's there, and ultimately it is what's referred to as a deadhead, I think. So an unserviceable vehicle. It's stripped of its usable parts. It's used for target practice by Canadians, and so you have tens of thousands of Canadians training in that bit of the South Downs, what is now the National Park, but which was a sort of designated training area ahead of the Normandy landing. So
of course,
it's like it takes you into a much bigger story. But I think you have that little artifact that starts your sort of journey. So I guess things like that.
Is that when you first discovering all this kind of Second World War heritage almost on your doorstep? Is that what first got you involved or interested in the work of the CWGC? Is that how you discovered our work?
I think definitely, yeah, almost certainly. And people will know one thing that's interesting about the Commission is you have those extraordinary sites in Europe and around the world, but you don't have to go very far in the UK to find a war grave. And once you've seen that and you've got your eye in, it becomes almost like an obsession, almost regardless of where you are. If you're near a parish church or something else, you seem to have to go and have a look to see if you can find one, or at least that's what I do. And I know I have a few colleagues
guilty as well.
Exactly. Yeah,
if our audience follows our Instagram page, they might have come across myself walking across some cemeteries.
Well, there you go.
But telling the stories behind some of the casualties. There's just so much, of course, in the UK alone, let alone 23,000 sites across the world that the Commission looks after.
Yeah, and those, as well as those artefacts and everything else, they're sort of snippets of a much deeper, broader, incredibly important history that's otherwise maybe hidden from everyday life because you walk past it and you don't engage with it in the same way.
So, George, you are an official historian at the CWGC. So, for our audience, what does an official historian do? What's your difficult question?
Well, it is a difficult question, but actually, anyone who knows anything about the official histories written after the First and Second World Wars, which is exactly what they sound like. So, in both cases, products of what was or is still, I think, the Cabinet Office, and an idea of you would engage professional historians, military experts to produce an overview of campaign histories, and anyone who's seen them will know exactly what that means. They're incredibly detailed. That's not what I do. So an unusual title that I didn't give myself. But I like to think of my role as being sort of broadly defined as making sure what the Commission says and does is grounded in a sort of full, proper understanding of its history and the context in which the organisation was established, and in which it has subsequently worked.
Okay, wow,
If that makes sense.
Yes, I think it's quite clear. Of course, I mean it's a lot. I mean, obviously, as a commission, we look after, you know, the war graves of the First and Second World War, and there's so much in terms of, you know, the history, in terms of what happened during the First World Wars, why we came into being, how our legacy continues today, and there's so much that, you know, we are currently doing in the world at the moment, and there's so much. And for example, one of the things I know you're working on is the Non-Commemorations Report. Can you tell us a bit about what that is?
Yeah, so I think that talking about that, what my job might entail in normal circumstances, as I was just describing it, I think actually since I joined the Commission at the beginning of 2020, it's largely been dedicated to what you refer to there, the Non-Commemoration Report. So we have known, the organisation has known for the majority of its existence, that there are a number of memorials in its care that do not have names on. And at the end of 2019, Channel 4 aired a documentary that raised some questions around those, and the ones that they laid emphasis on were in East Africa. And so there are 3 memorials, one in Nairobi, one in Mombasa, and one down in Dar es Salaam, and they are dedicated to African soldiers who died during the East African campaign in the First World War, for whom we don't have a place of burial. And this is the oddity about these particular memorials, we don't have their names. So we're commemorating, at the time, they would have said upwards of 50,000. We think it could be in excess of 100,000 men of those origins, like locally raised, dying in that theatre, and we don't have their names. And so anyone who knows anything about how the Commission works, about how commemoration works within the context of the Commission, it is at the name. The name is of course what the commemoration is. So it's either on a headstone over a marked grave, or it's on a memorial to the missing. So the Commission never draws a boundary between one of those being more significant than the other. They're both treated exactly the same. But in this case, as I say, what we don't have is the individual's name. So that's interesting, because what the Commission has spent at least the past 4 or more decades talking about is how everyone is treated exactly the same, regardless of who they are. So where they came from, what their religion was, what their ethnicity was, etc., etc. It didn't make a difference. And that was perhaps what made the Commission so interesting, and maybe what makes it stand out in the context of, you know, what you might understand about British imperialism, etc., etc. So it's interesting that you have these anomalies, and so what the project was initially doing. So we worked with an external committee of experts and community representatives, and what we were trying to do over the course of a year, and it happened to be the year that was the beginning of the COVID pandemic, which didn't help, but was to try and understand the extent of those issues. So I've just spoken about East Africa. You know, why was it that the Commission doesn't have those names? Why was it that they chose to commemorate in the way that they did? Was that a Commission decision? Was that something more difficult to explain? And what was the extent beyond that? So is that the only issue? Were there other issues, either within the same theatre or more broadly? And what we did within that year, so in April 21, we published that report, and there were 2 broad issues we uncovered. One was what I'm just talking about here, which is where people are being or not being commemorated, arguably. So they're not being commemorated by name, effectively. You know, we might therefore say they are not commemorated, or hence the non-commemoration aspect. The other part of this was people who were being treated differently. So they were being commemorated in ways that we would recognise as being normal to some extent. But something had taken place that meant, under certain circumstances, you wouldn't expect to see that elsewhere. And the best example of this is in quite a large number of cases connected to the Indian Army, where we may have known a burial site for an individual who was subsequently abandoned to commemorate them on a memorial, there's lots of different reasons why that was and why that might take place. But in comparison to what might have happened elsewhere, it was a difference in
And are we talking mostly First World War, or is this also the Second World War?
So that report was exclusively focusing on the First World War,
On the First World War.
because of it is where the vast majority of issues lie. We do know there are potentially some issues that do touch or are sort of not repeated, but some issues that are connected to the Second World War. But it's very different and in no way compares to the scale of what we're talking about connected to the First World War. It's without going into loads of detail,
Yes.
It's quite difficult to, I guess, explain why some of these things are happening. It isn't simply a case of the Commission not wanting to do it.
Okay.
I think that's the takeaway
yeah.
point that people need to
Okay.
understand. So it's not exclusively because of that.
It's also I imagine, how much time's passed, the difficulty in the archives as well. Is that something?
The archives is certainly difficulties we're facing now, trying to find those names if they exist. What is happening in the 1920s is the Commission is being told that the records don't exist, and so there isn't any way in which the colonial or military authorities can tell the Commission who those potentially 100,000 men were by name. We know because we've seen a whole host and different range of documents because we're trying to find them. We know that they almost certainly did exist in a number of different forms. There are then questions about how much the Commission knew about that from the correspondence that we have seen, would suggest that they didn't. But the conclusions we came to in the original report were basically that the Commission has to be seen as being complicit in any of those decisions that led to different commemoration because they effectively approved them in one way or another. So even if the Commission didn't know the names existed, it was willing to accept that they didn't and didn't, in certain circumstances, push harder to obtain them or go looking itself, which anyone who if a different hand, if you were looking at the way Commission works, you would say, well, that's not its job anyway, but that's an aside.
So we do publish reports, like we do update members of the public, and we do have on our website at www.cwgc.org updates on the work of the Non-Commemorations team.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, I'm still talking about that report, and as I said, that was out in April 21.
Yes.
What it led to, not only apologies from the Commission,
yep.
apologies from Ben Wallace, effectively de facto Commission chairman as Secretary of State for Defence in Parliament, but also the establishment of a 5-year project within the Commission to explore these issues in much greater detail, and more importantly, to try and find solutions to right any historical wrongs that still exist.
Of course, the work of the Non-Commemorations Report is so important because of the founding principle of the CWGC. I mean, as an organisation, we were founded to remember, obviously, the casualties of the First World War, all on an equal footing and equal importance. From the last private to the generals, even the way the headstones were designed to all be equal, to respect different ethnicities, different religions. So that's where this kind of ties in, because it's our founding principle to remember, the 1.7 million casualties in the 2 world wars, all at the same level, same importance, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's why, you were talking about non-commemorations. It's fundamental to remember the casualties from Africa and from other countries at the same as Britain or Canada or Australia or New Zealand, etc., isn't it?
Yeah. There's. It was always designed to be as inclusive as possible. So the memorials, the headstones, as you say, the design of the headstone is an interesting one because it's so controversial at the time because it's not cruciform, and there are large, powerful people within the United Kingdom who argue for that and petition the Commission to change to some form of cruciform headstone on the grounds that Britain is a Christian country at the time. I think probably still is considered as such in some level, at least it's state religion. But that's that sort of, there is that pressure and interest, and the Commission in Parliament defends its position. I think it's ultimately Churchill who maybe had
it's quite revolutionary, isn't it? I mean,
it is
for the time. We
thing.
are talking about 1917.
I think that's the thing that people maybe it's very difficult for us to disassociate ourselves from, I don't know, the context in which we currently reside in, the world in which we live now, and to place ourselves back then. But yeah, this is different, and it's progressive in a way that you wouldn't expect. You know, the organisation has the word imperial in its title, which is deeply, unfashionable, for want of a better term.
We just to remind, we were founded as the Imperial War Graves Commission.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting, Fabian Ware, the man who's ultimately almost single-handedly responsible for the organisation's establishment, what he's trying to do is, to all intents and purposes, unify empire by laying so much focus on the commonality of sacrifice. So everybody died in the name of the same cause, and therefore they should be treated exactly the same. I think that's what makes this particular episode within the organisation's history quite troubling and difficult to comprehend and get around, because that's not happening. And as I say, there are deeply complex reasons as to why, which are in the report, which people should go and read, which is on the website. But that's what we're attempting to reverse or correct if we can now.
Of course, and we will be delving deep into some of these issues in subsequent future episodes. In the meantime, thank you very much, George, for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.